Let me tell you about the most insufferable being in the known galaxy. His name was Zephyr Clicks, Cadet 47, and if you spent more than 5 minutes in his presence, you'd understand why several species had developed new curse words just to describe him adequately. The Galactic Military Academy floated in the Nexus system like a chrome monument to organized suffering. For 300 years it had been churning out the galaxy's finest military officers, and for the past 2 years, it had been churning out one very specific kind of headache named Zephyr. Picture this, a 7-foot-tall Centaurian with 4 arms, crystalline blue skin, and an ego so massive it had its own gravitational pull. Zephyr didn't just break Academy records, he obliterated them, then had the fragments bronzed and displayed in his dorm room. Combat simulations, tactical analysis, zero-gravity maneuvering, xenobiology exams, you name it, he owned it. Commander Blix, a gruff Vulcan with tusks that could open bottles and a perpetual headache from dealing with overachievers, kept a special board in his office just for Zephyr's achievements. It was 3 walls long and growing. Another record, Blix would grumble, updating the display with the enthusiasm of someone scheduling their own root canal. Cadet 47 has now completed the Krellian maze simulation in 4 minutes, 37 seconds. Previous record was 6 minutes, 12 seconds. Also his. The other cadets had mixed feelings about Zephyr's success. Cadet Knox, a shadowy Umbrian who communicated primarily through dramatic sighs and shoulder shrugs, represented the resentful admiration camp. Cadet Pip, an enthusiastic squeaker whose species evolved from something resembling a caffeinated hamster, led the worshipful awe faction. But how does he do it? Pip would squeak, literally bouncing off the walls during lunch breaks. I mean, I've got enhanced reflexes and I still can't even see the targets in the combat sim before he's already destroyed them. Zephyr, naturally, had an explanation ready. Superior genetics, obviously, he'd say, flexing all 4 arms simultaneously while somehow managing to eat, operate his datapad, and polish his metals at the same time. My people have been perfecting military strategy for millennia. It's simply in our DNA to excel. What made it worse, so much worse, was that Zephyr was actually a decent person underneath all that crystalline smugness. He'd help struggling classmates with their studies, share his meal rations, and had once carried an injured squeaker to the medical bay using 3 arms while taking notes for an exam with the 4th. It was impossible to properly hate him, which made everyone want to hate him even more. The Academy's holographic displays constantly updated with his achievements. Fastest time through the asteroid navigation course, highest score on the diplomatic relations exam, most creative solution to the impossible bridge problem, a tactical scenario that had stumped military minds for decades until Zephyr solved it by suggesting they simply go around the bridge instead of trying to cross it. Cadet 47 continues to redefine excellence, the Academy's promotional materials proudly stated. His innovative approaches and unmatched skills represent the pinnacle of Centaurian achievement and serve as an inspiration to cadets of all species. Faculty members had started betting on which record he'd break next. Professor Quill, the ancient wise one who taught advanced strategy, had lost his life savings 3 times over. And then, on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday that would later be remembered as the day everything changed, something unprecedented happened at the Galactic Military Academy. They admitted a human. Jake Murphy stepped off the transport shuttle and immediately walked into a wall. Not because he couldn't see it, the wall was bright orange and covered in warning symbols, but because he was looking at his dog instead of where he was going. "Nice place, Rex," he said, rubbing his nose while a crowd of alien cadets stared at him like he'd just performed an elaborate mating dance. "Very spacey." Rex, a medium-sized mutt with mismatched ears and the kind of expression that suggested he was perpetually plotting something, sniffed the air once and sat down. Several nearby cadets took an unconscious step backward. Commander Blix approached with the enthusiasm of someone greeting a tax audit. "Cadet Murphy, I presume. Welcome to the Academy. I trust your journey was adequate." "Oh, fantastic," Jake said, hefting a duffel bag that looked like it had survived several small wars. Rex loved the zero-gravity part. Didn't you, boy? Rex wagged his tail exactly once, which somehow made the watching aliens even more nervous. About the animal, Blix said, consulting his datapad with obvious confusion. The admission paperwork lists him as your emotional support companion, but our xenobiologists have never encountered this species. What exactly is a dog? He's a good boy, Jake said, as if this explained everything. It didn't. Mia. Zephyr clicks materialized at Jake's shoulder with the predatory grace of someone who'd spotted fresh entertainment. So you're the primitive species we've heard so much about. Humans, right? From that little backwater planet with the poisonous atmosphere? Earth, yeah, Jake said cheerfully. Though the atmosphere isn't really poisonous, you just have to evolve to breathe that, which admittedly takes a while. Fascinating, Zephyr said, in a tone that suggested it was anything but. And this creature is your, what exactly? Food? Transportation? Rex fixed Zephyr with a stare that could have melted hull plating. The Zentorian's smug expression wavered slightly. He's family, Jake said simply. The first day of orientation went about as well as you'd expect. Jake couldn't figure out the gravity controls in his dorm and spent an hour floating near the ceiling. He got lost trying to find the cafeteria and somehow ended up in the reactor core, where he spent 20 minutes having a pleasant conversation with a maintenance droid about the weather back on Earth. During the mandatory equipment demonstration, Jake stared at the standard-issue plasma rifle like it had personally insulted his ancestors. So this is the safety, this is the trigger, and this setting disintegrates matter at the molecular level? Correct, said Instructor Vex, a patient Crystallian who'd explained the same weapon to thousands of cadets. Any questions? Yeah, Jake said. Why would you ever want to disintegrate something at the molecular level? The question hung in the air like a toxic gas leak. Around the training ground, other cadets exchanged glances. Why wouldn't you want to disintegrate things at the molecular level? That was the point. For combat purposes, Vex suggested. Right, but like what if you just wanted to knock someone unconscious? Or scare them? Or make them think really hard about their life choices? Rex, meanwhile, had stationed himself at the edge of the training ground and was watching the exercises with an intensity that made several instructors uncomfortable. When Cadet Knox attempted to demonstrate advanced plasma techniques, Rex's head tilted slightly to the left. Knox promptly missed every target. Your companion seems observant, Commander Blix noted. Rex is smart, Jake agreed. Probably smarter than me, to be honest. I'm just better at opening cans. By the end of the first day, Jake had failed the basic navigation test, scored in the bottom percentile on tactical awareness, and somehow reprogrammed the food synthesizer to produce something called hot dogs, which nobody could identify but everyone agreed smelled disturbingly appealing. Well, Zephyr announced to anyone within earshot, at least we don't have to worry about the human breaking any records. Unless there's a category for most confused newcomer, in which case he's definitely got potential. The other cadets laughed, but it was nervous laughter. There was something about the human and his companion that didn't quite fit the usual patterns. Jake seemed genuinely unbothered by his failures, and Rex, well, Rex kept watching everything with those unsettling dark eyes, like he was taking notes for later. I give him a week, Zephyr predicted confidently. 2 at most. Commander Blix made a note in his datapad and tried to ignore the growing certainty that he was about to have a very, very long semester. The Academy's challenge system was designed to systematically crush the spirits of overconfident young beings from across the galaxy. It had been refined over centuries to identify weaknesses, exploit limitations, and generally sort the wheat from the chaff with ruthless efficiency. Jake Murphy looked at the challenge board like it was a restaurant menu written in a language he didn't recognize. So the Krellian maze is supposed to test spatial reasoning and tactical thinking, explained Cadet Pip, who'd appointed herself as Jake's unofficial guide to not dying horribly. It's this really complex three-dimensional puzzle where you have to navigate through shifting corridors while avoiding security drones and reaching the center before time runs out. Sounds fun, Jake said. Rex, sitting beside him, made a sound that might have been agreement or might have been a suppressed laugh. Zephyr materialized with his usual impeccable timing. Ah, the human is attempting the maze. This should be educational. My record, by the way, is 4 minutes and 37 seconds. I don't expect you to come close, but do try not to embarrass your entire species. Jake entered the simulation chamber and immediately got turned around in the first corridor. The walls shifted, rearranging themselves into new configurations while security drones hummed ominously overhead. Standard protocol dictated mapping the changes, calculating optimal routes, and proceeding with systematic precision. Jake took 3 wrong turns, triggered every proximity alarm, and somehow ended up back at the starting point. Well, that's not working, he announced to no one in particular. Then he sat down cross-legged in the middle of the corridor and closed his eyes. What is he doing? Pip squeaked, watching through the observation window. I believe, Commander Blix said slowly, he's thinking. Rex had positioned himself at the control panel, which shouldn't have been possible since dogs weren't supposed to understand Academy security protocols. He sat perfectly still, but his eyes tracked every movement in the maze with mathematical precision. After 2 minutes of apparent meditation, Jake stood up and started moving. But instead of following the logical pathways, he began tapping on walls, listening to the resonance patterns. When a section sounded hollow, he'd trace its outline with his finger. The walls aren't solid, he said, though whether he was talking to himself or to Rex was unclear. They're projections over a basic framework, if I can find the pattern. He pressed his palm against what appeared to be solid metal. His hand went right through. Holographic camouflage, Instructor Vex muttered. But how did he know? Jake started moving through the maze like he owned the place, phasing through false walls and ignoring the programmed pathways entirely. Security drones swooped down to intercept him, but he'd duck under them at exactly the right moment, as if he could predict their attack patterns. This is impossible, Zephyr said, his 4 hands clenched into fists. The security algorithm is completely randomized. There's no way to predict. Jake reached the center of the maze in 6 minutes and 43 seconds. Not a record, but respectable for someone who'd never seen the challenge before. How? Blix demanded when Jake emerged from the simulation chamber. Rex helped, Jake said, scratching behind the dog's ears. He's got great hearing. Could tell which walls were real by the sound dampening patterns. Everyone turned to look at Rex, who was now lying down with his head on his paws, looking like the most innocent creature in the galaxy. But that's, Cadet Knox began, then stopped. Umbrians communicated through shadows and implications, but even they didn't have words for what they'd just witnessed. The tactical analysis challenge went similarly. Jake ignored the provided strategic frameworks and instead treated the entire scenario like a game of 3-dimensional chess crossed with improvisational theater. He lost his first 3 battles spectacularly, then won the next 7 using strategies that made the combat instructors question their career choices. He's not following any established tactical doctrine, Professor Quill observed, reviewing the battle recordings with growing bewilderment. His approach is completely chaotic. Not chaotic, Commander Blix corrected, studying the data more carefully. Unpredictable. There's a difference. Zephyr's confidence began showing hairline cracks. His records still stood, but Jake's unorthodox approaches were generating results that shouldn't have been possible. More disturbing was the way other cadets had started watching Jake's attempts with genuine interest. Maybe we could try the human method, Pip suggested during one tactical briefing. There is no human method, Zephyr snapped. There's correct military doctrine and there's random flailing around. Guess which category primitive planet solutions fall into? But even as he said it, Zephyr found himself studying Jake's techniques. The human's approaches violated every principle of logical strategic thinking, yet somehow they worked. It was like watching someone solve complex mathematical equations by interpretive dance. Rex, meanwhile, had become the Academy's most enigmatic resident. He'd show up at training sessions and position himself where he could observe everything. Instructors started unconsciously adjusting their teaching styles when the dog was present, though none of them could explain why. "There's something about that animal," Instructor Vex confided to Blix. "The way he watches everything, it's like he understands exactly what's happening." "Don't be ridiculous," Blix replied. "He's just a pet. A very attentive pet." But late that night, reviewing security footage, Blix watched Rex perform what could only be described as reconnaissance. The dog systematically explored the Academy's training facilities, examining equipment with the methodical thoroughness of a professional intelligence operative. Which was, of course, completely impossible. Dogs were just animals. The first record to fall was asteroid navigation, and it fell hard. Jake approached the simulation like he was parallel parking a shopping cart, instead of piloting a starfighter through a debris field that had claimed virtual lives for decades. While other cadets calculated trajectory vectors and acceleration curves, Jake simply flew. "He's not even using the navigation computer," Instructor Vex reported, his voice climbing into frequencies that shouldn't have been possible for his species. "He's flying purely by visual reference and intuition." "That's impossible," Zephyr said, but his certainty was starting to sound forced. "The asteroid field simulation is specifically designed to overwhelm organic reaction times. You have to use the computer systems or you'll be reduced to component atoms." Jake threaded his virtual starfighter through gaps that existed for microseconds, rolled around tumbling asteroids the size of small moons, and somehow made the entire exercise look like a leisurely Sunday drive. His time, 3 minutes and 14 seconds, shattering Zephyr's record by nearly a full minute. Rex, watching from the observation deck, wagged his tail exactly twice. "Beginner's luck," Zephyr muttered, but several other cadets were already signing up for additional navigation practice sessions. The xenobiology exam fell next. Jake approached the practical identification test with the same casual confidence he brought to everything else, except this time he had an advantage that nobody anticipated. "Subject 47 appears to be a Rigelian combat slug," Jake announced, examining a particularly nasty specimen that had sent 3 previous cadets to the medical bay. "Highly venomous, aggressive when threatened, probably tastes terrible." Professor Quill blinked all 6 of his ancient eyes. "How could you possibly know about taste preferences?" "Rex licked the containment field," Jake said. "He's got excellent judgment about these things." Sure enough, Rex was sitting near the specimen container with an expression of profound disgust, occasionally shaking his head as if trying to remove a bad taste from his mouth. Jake proceeded to identify every single organism in the test battery, including several that weren't supposed to be identifiable without specialized equipment. His method was simple: show each specimen to Rex and interpret his reactions. Tail wag, harmless. Ear droop, dangerous. Hackles raised, definitely don't touch. Head tilt, probably edible but not recommended. "This is scientifically absurd," Professor Quill declared. But Jake's score of 98%, he'd missed one question because Rex had been distracted by a maintenance droid spoke for itself. By the end of the week, Jake had broken 3 more records, and the Academy's social dynamics were shifting like tectonic plates. Cadet Pip had started taking notes during Jake's challenge attempts, filling entire datapads with observations about human problem-solving methods. Cadet Knox, who communicated primarily through meaningful glances, had begun following Jake around like a shadow, though whether this was admiration or professional surveillance remained unclear. "Maybe," Pip suggested during a late-night study session. "We're thinking about these challenges all wrong." "There's no wrong way to think about military challenges," Zephyr replied automatically, but his usual conviction was notably absent. Strategic thinking follows established principles that have been tested across thousands of years of galactic warfare. "But what if the principles are incomplete?" Pip persisted. "I mean, humans evolved on a planet with weather and predators and all sorts of random variables. Maybe they're just better at dealing with chaos?" Zephyr's crystalline features darkened to a deep navy blue, a Zentorian indication of serious internal conflict. "Chaos isn't a military strategy. It's the absence of strategy." Yet privately, he found himself reviewing recordings of Jake's performances with growing confusion. The humans' methods shouldn't work, but they consistently produced results. Worse, they produced results that were measurably better than traditional approaches. The tipping point came during the advanced tactical simulation, a complex scenario involving multiple enemy factions, shifting alliances, and resource management constraints that typically required teams of cadets working in perfect coordination. Jake entered the simulation alone. "This is unprecedented," Commander Blix muttered, watching Jake's initial deployment. He's completely ignored the standard opening protocols. Instead of establishing secure communications and conducting reconnaissance, Jake had sent his virtual forces charging directly into what appeared to be a strategic death trap. Military doctrine suggested he'd be eliminated within minutes. 30 minutes later, Jake had not only survived but had somehow convinced 2 enemy factions to form an alliance, convinced a third to switch sides entirely, and was now using the 4th faction's own supply lines to fuel a counterattack that defied every principle of conventional warfare. "He's treating it like a social problem instead of a military problem," Professor Quill observed with something approaching awe. "He's negotiating with the enemy AI systems as if they were reasonable beings with legitimate concerns." Jake's final time, 47 minutes and 12 seconds. The previous record, held jointly by a team of 4 senior cadets including Zephyr, 2 hours and 18 minutes. "This doesn't make sense," Zephyr said, staring at the results display with all 4 hands pressed against the glass. "You can't just ignore military doctrine and expect to win." "Maybe," Commander Blix said slowly. "Military doctrine needs some updating." Rex chose that moment to stand up, stretch, and perform what could only be described as a satisfied yawn. Several nearby cadets took an instinctive step backward. In his private quarters that night, Zephyr attempted to analyze Jake's techniques using standard strategic frameworks. Every analysis suggested that Jake's approaches should have failed catastrophically, yet the results spoke for themselves. For the first time in his life, Zephyr Klix found himself doubting not just his own abilities, but the entire foundation of everything he thought he understood about military excellence. It was, he admitted privately, a profoundly uncomfortable feeling. The Omega Protocol had been the Academy's final examination for over 2 centuries, and in all that time, exactly 0 cadets had ever completed it successfully. It wasn't designed to be passed, it was designed to be a beautiful, elaborate failure that would teach final-year cadets the important lesson that some problems simply couldn't be solved. The scenario was fiendishly complex, a multi-stage challenge combining space combat, diplomatic negotiations, resource management, and ethical decision-making, all while operating under increasingly impossible constraints. Most cadets managed to complete 2 or 3 stages before the scenario's built-in contradictions forced them into an unwinnable position. Zephyr had made it further than anyone else in Academy history, successfully navigating 4 of the 7 stages before being eliminated by what the designers called the compassion trap, a situation where saving civilian lives would compromise mission objectives, and completing the mission would result in massive civilian casualties. "I've studied this scenario for months," he announced as he entered the simulation chamber for what everyone assumed would be another record-setting near success. "I've identified 17 distinct decision trees and calculated optimal responses for every possible variable combination." Commander Blix nodded approvingly. This was exactly the kind of systematic preparation that made Zentorians such exceptional military officers. Zephyr lasted exactly 43 minutes before the scenario's logical paradoxes boxed him into an impossible choice. He emerged from the chamber with his crystalline features displaying the deep purple of philosophical frustration. "The scenario is mathematically unsolvable," he declared. Stage 5 presents a classic ethical paradox with no correct answer. "Perhaps," Professor Quill suggested gently, "that's the point." Jake approached the Omega Protocol with his usual casual confidence, though Rex seemed more alert than usual, positioning himself at the observation window with the focused attention of a professional consultant. "So this is the impossible one?" Jake asked, stretching like he was about to jog around the block instead of attempting the Academy's most notorious challenge. "Cadet Murphy," Commander Blick said formally, "the Omega Protocol has never been completed in the Academy's history. It's designed to test the limits of strategic thinking and ethical reasoning. No cadet is expected to." "Cool," Jake interrupted. "Let's see what happens." He entered the simulation chamber, and for the first few minutes, everything proceeded exactly as expected. Jake navigated the initial combat scenarios with his characteristic improvisation, turning what should have been tactical engagements into something resembling extreme sports. But then something unprecedented happened. Instead of progressing through the stages sequentially, Jake began treating the entire scenario as a single, interconnected system. When Stage 3 presented him with a resource shortage, he didn't just manage the immediate crisis, he traced the problem back to decisions made in Stage 1 and forward to consequences in Stage 6. "He's not solving the stages individually," Instructor Vex observed, studying the data streams with growing amazement. "He's rewriting the entire scenario structure." At Stage 5, the notorious compassion trap that had eliminated Zephyr, Jake encountered the impossible choice between mission success and civilian casualties. Military doctrine provided clear guidance: mission objectives take precedence. Jake ignored military doctrine entirely. Instead, he opened communication channels with every faction involved in the scenario, including ones that weren't supposed to be reachable, and began what could only be described as group therapy. "Look," he said to a virtual enemy commander who had been programmed to be completely unreasonable, "I get that you're angry about the whole territorial dispute thing, but have you considered that maybe we're all just stressed out and making bad decisions because we're not communicating effectively?" The enemy AI, which had never been programmed to respond to psychological evaluation, paused for several seconds before replying. "I had not considered that perspective." "Right?" Jake continued. "So instead of shooting at each other, what if we figured out what everyone actually needs and worked backward from there?" Rex, meanwhile, had begun doing something that defied all known laws of canine behavior. He was watching the simulation displays with mathematical precision, and every few minutes he would make a small sound, not quite a bark, not quite a whine, that somehow conveyed specific tactical information. Jake would glance at Rex, nod, and then implement strategies that shouldn't have existed. "The dog is coaching him," Cadet Knox observed in a rare moment of verbal communication. "Don't be ridiculous," Blix replied automatically, but he was watching Rex with growing suspicion. At Stage 6, where the scenario traditionally collapsed into chaos as multiple crisis points converged simultaneously, Jake had somehow convinced 3 separate enemy factions to form a temporary alliance, negotiated a resource-sharing agreement with a 4th faction, and was currently mediating a diplomatic discussion between 2 AI systems that had been shooting at each other for the past hour. "This is impossible," Zephyr whispered, watching Jake's progress with a mixture of awe and existential terror. "He's not just completing the scenario. He's making everyone friends." Stage 7 arrived with the subtlety of a gravitational collapse. Every system failure, every political crisis, every ethical dilemma that had been building throughout the scenario came crashing together in a perfect storm of unsolvable problems. Jake looked at the chaos, looked at Rex, and grinned. "Okay, boy," he said. Time for the really stupid plan. What happened next would be debated by military strategists for decades. Jake didn't solve Stage 7, he convinced Stage 7 to solve itself. By treating the entire crisis as a communication problem, rather than a tactical problem, he had somehow created conditions where every faction involved had a vested interest in finding cooperative solutions. The simulation ended not with military victory or strategic triumph, but with something the designers had never considered, that everyone involved agreeing that they'd probably been overreacting and should maybe try talking things through next time. Total completion time 1 hour, 47 minutes and 33 seconds. The Academy's computer systems, faced with a scenario they'd been programmed to believe was impossible, spent several minutes processing the results before displaying a message that made Commander Blix seriously consider early retirement. Omega Protocol completed. New paradigm detected. Updating strategic databases. Rex wagged his tail exactly 3 times and somehow managed to look smug about it. The aftermath of Jake's Omega Protocol completion was, to put it mildly, complete chaos. The Academy's strategic database spent 3 days recalibrating its fundamental assumptions about problem solving. Professor Quill had to lie down in a dark room for several hours. Commander Blix discovered that he'd been unconsciously grinding his tusks and had to schedule an emergency dental appointment. And Zephyr Clix experienced something that no Zentorian in recorded history had ever voluntarily chosen: humility. "I don't understand," he said, sitting across from Jake in the Academy cafeteria while Rex systematically evaluated different flavors of synthetic protein. "Everything you did violated basic strategic principles. You ignored established protocols, treated military scenarios like social gatherings, and somehow made it work." Jake shrugged, offering Rex a piece of something that resembled chicken but probably wasn't. Maybe the principles needed updating? "But how did you know what to do?" "Military strategy is supposed to be based on analysis, planning, preparation." "I listened to Rex," Jake said simply. Everyone turned to look at the dog, who was now lying on his back with all 4 legs in the air, looking like the most unremarkable creature in the galaxy. "Your pet coached you through the most complex military scenario ever devised?" Zephyr asked slowly. "Rex isn't my pet," Jake corrected. "He's my partner. And yeah, he's pretty good at reading situations." Cadet Pip, who had been taking notes throughout this conversation, looked up from her datapad. "But how can a non-sentient animal understand tactical scenarios?" Jake and Rex exchanged a look that contained several layers of private communication. "Who said anything about non-sentient?" Jake asked. The revelation that Rex might be significantly more intelligent than anyone had assumed sent ripples through the Academy's xenobiology department. Professor Quill, despite his recent traumatic experience with paradigm shifts, became fascinated with the question of Earth canine intelligence. "Preliminary scans suggest cognitive capabilities well beyond standard baseline measurements," he reported to the Faculty Council. "The creature appears to process visual and auditory information at rates approaching advanced AI systems." "So the human brought a biological computer to Military Academy," Commander Blix concluded. "More like a tactical consultant," Jake corrected when asked about it directly. "Rex has always been good at figuring out what people need. I just learned to pay attention." The Academy's response to Jake's unprecedented success was typically bureaucratic. They formed a committee to study the implications, updated their promotional materials to include innovative problem-solving approaches, and quietly began incorporating elements of Jake's methods into the standard curriculum. Zephyr found himself in the unexpected position of learning from someone he'd initially dismissed as inferior. It was, he admitted, a profoundly educational experience. "The human approach to strategic thinking is completely irrational," he explained to anyone who would listen, "but somehow it accounts for variables that traditional analysis misses." "Such as?" Professor Quill prompted. "Feelings," Zephyr said, as if the word tasted strange. He treats everyone in a scenario as if they have emotions and motivations beyond their programmed objectives. It shouldn't work, but it does, Quill finished. Within weeks, cadets from across the galaxy were requesting transfer applications to study what the Academy had begun calling adaptive strategic thinking. Jake found himself accidentally famous, which he handled with his characteristic nonchalance. "It's not really about me," he explained during an interview with the Galactic Military Review. "Rex does most of the heavy lifting. I just translate his insights into human language." Rex, when asked for comment, performed a complex series of tail wags and head tilts that somehow conveyed both modesty and professional satisfaction. The interview concluded with a question that had been puzzling military theorists across the galaxy. Why had Jake chosen to attend the Academy in the first place? "Oh, that's easy," Jake said, scratching behind Rex's ears. "Rex wanted to see space. We figured military academy was probably the safest way to get off planet, since they have all those safety protocols and emergency procedures." The interviewer paused. "You're saying you enrolled in the galaxy's most prestigious military institution because your dog wanted to travel?" Jake considered this. "Pretty much, yeah. Plus, Rex likes meeting new people, and there's definitely a lot of variety here." As if summoned by the mention of his social preferences, Rex stood up, stretched, and wandered over to where Cadet Knox was sitting. The shadowy Umbrian, who typically communicated only through meaningful silences, found himself engaged in what appeared to be a detailed conversation conducted entirely through nonverbal cues. "Your companion appears to be making friends," the interviewer observed. "Rex is good at that," Jake agreed. "Better than me, honestly. I'm just better at opening cans and operating door handles." 3 months later, Jake and Rex graduated with honors, having established a new category of military excellence that the Academy was still trying to figure out how to replicate. Jake's final evaluation contained phrases like unprecedented tactical innovation and revolutionary approach to conflict resolution, but also noted that he had never mastered the proper use of plasma rifle safety protocols. Their graduation ceremony was attended by representatives from 17 different military organizations, 3 diplomatic corps, and 1 delegation of xenobiologists who were still trying to determine Rex's exact species classification. "So what's next?" Commander Blix asked as Jake prepared to board the transport that would take them to their first assignment. Jake consulted with Rex, who performed an elaborate sequence of movements that somehow conveyed specific coordinate information. "Rex heard about this place called the Disputed Zone," Jake said. "Apparently there's been a conflict there for about 200 years that nobody's been able to resolve. Sounds like it might be a communication problem." Blix watched the transport disappear into hyperspace and made a note in his personal log: "Recommend establishing emergency diplomatic protocols for Disputed Zone. Also recommend increased supply of headache medication for local commanders." Back at the Academy, Zephyr Clix was already working on his application for advanced studies in adaptive strategic thinking. His personal statement concluded with a phrase that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier: "I have discovered that there is still much I need to learn." And in the Academy's promotional materials, a new line appeared: "Excellence comes in many forms." Sometimes it even comes with 4 legs and a tail. Rex, wherever he was in the galaxy, probably would have approved.